The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today and welcome to the Managing Conflict webinar. My name's Ria Sheridan. I'm the Professional Development Advisor at CIWM and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. I know that several of you have attended webinars before, so do forgive me if you've heard all of my housekeeping spiel at the times. You have noticed, I'm sure, that your microphones are muted. They will remain muted throughout, but you are still able to and encouraged to ask questions by typing these into your question box on your screen. Your questions aren't public, they can only be seen by the organisers, so do feel free to ask anything you like. If you lose your dashboard at any point, there's a small arrow at the top left-hand corner in an orange box. If you can click on that, it shows and hides it. Anybody joining from an iPad, though, you will have a grey strip at the top of the screen instead of a square dashboard. If you do manage to minimise or to lose your webinar presentation screen, click on the blue flower on your taskbar at the bottom of your monitor and that will make it reappear. This session is being recorded and a link to this will be shared with you via email. About this time tomorrow, you should get an email that pops into your inbox. You'll be able to revisit the recording of the slides as well as hear any of the presentation at your leisure. We also have some handouts for you. If you'd like to click on your handouts, you can view and download these during the webinar at any time. And all of the audience questions that you put to our panelists today, they'll all be answered after each presentation. And this will give you a chance to type them into that question box as you think of them, and do submit your typed questions throughout rather than waiting at the end so that your question isn't missed. If we run out of time before we've had a chance to answer all of your questions, because it's a very interesting topic, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, the panelists are very happy to respond individually by email to you. It is audience participation, so you're going to be asked for your opinions throughout in the form of multiple choice polls, so do watch out for these popping up on your screen. At the end of the webinar, there will be a very brief survey when you log out, and there are only 2 questions, so it can't be much shorter. Please, if you could take a couple of minutes to tell us what you think. Your views are really important to us. So, on with the webinar. I'm going to introduce you to our panelists and our sessions. Today we have Maggie Newton, the founder of Clematis Coaching Services, Maggie Clinton, founder and director of Wrenwell Limited, Caroline Robertson, CEO at Actif HR. Caroline's also a non-practicing solicitor. Our sessions today, we've got 3 sessions for you: managing conflict at work, mental health and work, and also conflict management. So without further ado, I am going to remind you about questions. Do pop them in your question box as you're going along. But first of all, we have a question for you. I'm going to ask you a question, and I hope that you will all join in with this. You'll have about 30 seconds to choose your answer. So how confident are you at managing conflict at work? Now, are you extremely confident? Come on, bring it on. Are you reasonably confident? Are you not very confident, or do you avoid it at all costs? I'm going to give you a moment. Now we've got quite a lot of answers popping in straight away. We've got 93% of you have voted, so I'm actually going to close the poll and I'm going to share the results with you. So we've got 52% of you, that's over half of you, are reasonably confident. That's fantastic. But then we also have 44% of you that are not very confident. So I'm going to hand you over to our first panelist, who is Maggie Newton. Maggie's coach and facilitator and a trainer for Clematis. I'm sure that Maggie will want to talk about what we've just shared. Maggie, welcome.
Thank you. And welcome everybody. So I'm Maggie Newton, Clematis Coaching Services. I set up nearly 4 years ago after 30 odd years in the corporate world, and my last role was managing the organics program at RAP. So I'm very familiar with the sector. So these days I help grow confident communicators and leaders through coaching, workshops and DISC personality profiling. And over the years, I've had a lot of experience of dealing with difficult conversations and managing conflict. Next slide. So in terms of objectives, what we're going to cover between the three of us this morning are some background information from me on understanding the causes of conflict. We're very much going to look at how we can build this confidence. So the poll results were extremely interesting. And we're going to repeat it at the end, and hopefully we're going to see that some of you will now shift either, if not into the reasonably confident, or into the extremely confident and bring it on. We're also going to share some tips and techniques with you so that at the end of the day, you're going to be able to tackle this a lot more proactively than maybe you've been used to doing so in the past. Next slide. So in terms of definition of workplace conflict, so there's obviously lots of definitions, but one of them is a state of discord caused by the actual or perceived opposition of needs, values and interests between people working together. So conflict abounds in the workplace, and research shows that each of us spends on average of 2 to 3 hours a week involved in some way in conflict. So that's an awful lot of time. In the majority of cases, outcomes are unsatisfactory and can lead to fallouts, disharmony and distractions from the real purpose of work. But what is conflict? So being difficult can take many forms. It could be persistent negativity, open hostility, ignoring, contradicting. Most of us probably perceive conflict as a negative, but that's not always the case. It can be useful as it pushes conflicting parties to communicate and share ideas. So my focus for the next few slides is very much going to be on the behavioural aspect and understanding how people tick and how they might approach conflict, because the more you understand, the easier it will be. So, what causes conflict at work? Well, there's lots of possible causes of conflict, and here are some of the main ones. So, in terms of resources, that could be manager support, it could be budget, it could be time. So, you might have a scenario where maybe a colleague is getting a lot of support from the manager, a lot of hand-holding, and another colleague isn't getting the same amount. So this is about ensuring that in order to do your job well, you've got everything you need in place. Now, working styles, this is a really interesting one. So imagine a scenario, you share an office with a colleague and you are very punctual, you like a very tidy workspace, you're quiet on the phone, very well organised, but your colleague is the exact opposite. He rushes in late, there's empty coffee cups everywhere, files, the desk is a mess, talks really loudly on the phone, you can't concentrate, and sometimes you dread coming into the office. And there's arguments. So this is a very clear example of two completely different working and probably personality styles. And once you've realised this, you've got a starting point for thinking about how you can work together more effectively. Then we have goals, so ensuring that goals are very clear, that they don't conflict with others that are set for them or others. So objectives should very much align. Personal values, and I've got an exercise that you can do on this towards the end of the presentation, but they can often come into play where you've got clashes in personal values. And some of the other things on there are, perceptions, pressures of work, are there clear roles and responsibilities? And, what are the policies? Do the policies chop and change all the time and the changes aren't communicated? So why do we avoid conflict? Well, lots of reasons. Some of us can fear it, and those fears can either be real or perceived. At other times, there's a feeling of being responsible for fixing it and solving the problem. For a lot of us, there's that discomfort around any kind of emotion. So whether that's a raised voice, a slammed fist, tears, we feel uncomfortable around that emotion. Not being liked, so that loss of popularity, and afraid it could get out of hand. And I'm sure we could probably all think of an example where, you know, it has come to fighting. Extreme, I know, but that's sometimes the reality. But when you prepare in advance, that can really help build your confidence. And if we don't deal with conflict, bad behaviour can get out of hand. It upsets everybody. The team suffers. And you lose your reputation as a manager because you're not dealing with it. So one of the tools that I use a lot in the coaching and the programs, the work that I do with teams, is DISC, personality profiling. Because if you understand your own and other people's profile, it gives you insights and a greater understanding, and it helps you build more positive and constructive working relationships. So DISC is one of many personality profiling tools, and it was created in the 20s by Dr. William Marston, and he grouped people along two axes, whether they had either active or passive tendencies, or they were task or people orientated or outgoing and reserved, and came up with 4 different styles. So we have our D for dominance. Ds are very direct, they're very challenging, very confident, fast-paced, competitive. I for influence, outgoing and very much people-focused. They're very talkative, optimistic, friendly, creative. We have the S's for steadiness. They're very good listeners, very patient, very loyal. They like routine. And we have C for compliance. They very much like the detail. They have high standards, attention to detail. They can be perfectionists. And different personality types are likely to react differently to conflict. So Ds are likely to tackle it head on. They may react too quickly, and some may see their behaviour as a personal attack. Is want to be liked. So they don't want to lose popularity, and they may become a little bit overdramatic. S will avoid like the plague and possibly cave in to avoid any tension because they very much like harmony. And C's again will try to avoid conflict. They will very much want to see the evidence. They'll want the facts and the figures, and they'll want time to think about it, so there may not be an immediate resolution. Another tool that you can use is called the Thomas Killman conflict mode. And this is a tool that helps you understand your default approach in conflict. And it helps encourage different ways of handling different situations. So there's 2 dimensions. The vertical axis is concerned with conflict responses based on our attempt to get what we want. And the other dimension is concerned with responses based on helping others get what they want. And they created from these 5 different modes of response. So in the competing mode, you take a wholly assertive and uncooperative approach to resolving the conflict. So you stand up for your rights, you're very defensive, and it's my way or the highway. If you take an accommodating approach, you take a wholly unassertive and a cooperative approach. And that might mean you just completely cave in, you give in all the time, even though you might prefer not to, and you yield to someone else's point of view. Avoiding means you take an unassertive and uncooperative approach to the conflict, and you don't deal with it. So you'd sidestep it, you'd postpone it, or you'd just completely withdraw. Compromising is at the centre of the model because it's both assertive and cooperative, but only to some extent. So it's a bit of the half a sixpence is better than none approach. It's not necessarily the right approach to take all the time. Both sides get something, but not everything. So that might mean give and take or seeking a quick solution to get the middle ground. And the final one is collaborating, which is probably the aspirational one. And that means being willing to believe that when 2 parties are at loggerheads, it's possible for both sides to come out with what they want. And that requires developed conflict resolution skills based on mutual respect and a willingness to listen to others.
Well, we have another question for you, the audience, now. We would like to know, just because we're nosy, what's your default conflict style? Now, are you competing? Do you consider yourself collaborating, compromising, accommodating, or avoiding? I'd be very interested to see what people think they are. I've already got an idea what I am, but I'm not going to share that with you. So I'll give you a few more seconds. What's your default conflict style? Competing, collaborating, compromising, accommodating, or avoiding? Okay, the majority of you have voted. You've got another second to click and choose. And it's difficult to choose just one sometimes. Okay, let's have a see what people thought they were. So Maggie, what do you think about this one?
I'm just making a note of the answers, really.
So we've got competing at 11%, collaborating at 30%, compromising 33% of you, so a third of you think you're compromisers, 19% are accommodating, and 7% think you're an avoiding style. Okay.
So there's quite a few compromises there, and as I said before, that's not necessarily the best, but it's really encouraging to see that 30% of you are actively collaborating, which is great. 7% of you avoiding, so yes, still a bit of work to do there.
Okay, Maggie, on to your next slide.
Thank you. So, building on that, this is a diagram that shows what happens to our tendencies when we're under pressure. So, in general terms, when we're under pressure, we have certain tendencies which will lead to certain actions. Those actions will have consequences, and this will impact on our reality in terms of how we see things. And if we can, at the point of the tendency, break the pattern, interrupt the tendency and form a new habit, we can therefore adopt a different approach which will change the rest of the way around that diagram. And on average, it takes at least 21 days for a new habit to form. So let's say that we have a manager whose tendency is to avoid conflict. So there's a team member who's been particularly abrupt with clients and customers. Now, as a manager with a tendency to avoid conflict, you do nothing, you take no action. So the consequence is that abruptness continues, there are complaints from colleagues and customers. Your reality is it's not that bad. Now, adopting an alternative tendency, collaborating, the action would be to initiate a discussion, present and talk about the evidence, use open questions to get feedback. And the consequence might be that as a result of doing that, you find out they've never actually had any customer service training. So you can now agree a development plan and things can start to improve. And then a final couple of tips and techniques for you before I hand over to Maggie. So some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the GROW model, which is particularly well used in coaching, but it can also be used to structure a conversation. So this is very much about using open questions, and I know Caroline's going to come on later and talk about open questions. But if you're having a conversation around conflict, start with a goal. Where should we be? What could we achieve by collaborating? Look at the reality. So where are we now? So what's the evidence? What's been happening? You know, what happens if we continue to avoid or compete or continue as we are? Then we go on to options. You know, what can we do? What do colleagues do? So lots of ideas here. And then at the end of it, agreeing a way forward. So what will we do? When will we do it? And when will we view it? So that can be quite a helpful, simple structure to help you construct and undertake a managing conflict conversation. And then finally, on to values. And this is an exercise that you can do individually, but you can also do as a team as well. And it could be that, as I said before, you've got conflicting values, which is causing the conflict. So actually understanding your own values and the values of others in the team can be really helpful. So an exercise you can do is to simply ask yourself the question, what's most important to me at work? And come up with the top 10 things. And then you might want to do that collectively as a team. So you might want to have a conversation or a team meeting around what do we want our values to be as a team? Get everybody to contribute towards those. But then think about, once you've done that, to what extent are you actually honouring those values, and almost like score yourself out of 10. So for example, let's say that one of the values was respect. You know, is everybody's opinion being listened to without comment and without judgment? So how might you score yourself on respect out of 10? And you know, what could you then do to get to a 10 out of 10? So that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Maggie. That was an extremely interesting presentation, particularly the avoiding conflict. A lot of people, and most people, feel very uncomfortable around confrontation, and it is one of those things that's very difficult. It's easier to sort of pop your head in the sand like an emu, but it's definitely something that we should address, isn't it? I loved the change in your tendencies under pressure. It's such a simple thing to think about. If I change the way I behave under pressure, then the outcome is going to be different. So that's absolutely marvellous. Thank you very much for that. We have a few questions for you. I'm going to ask you the first one. We've had a question that says, does the DISC theory assume people are mostly one type, or can you be a mixture of all of them?
So most of us tend to be a mixture of one or two. You can be a mixture of three, but most of us would tend to have be a combination. So that means that the examples I gave were quite extreme. If you're a mixture, depending on the levels, it may not perhaps be as obvious to spot a D or to spot an I if you're a bit more of a combination. But yes, very much most of us would be a combination.
Thank you very much for that. We have another, well, we actually have a couple of questions that I think are sort of quite similar, so I'm going to roll them into one. You mentioned forced environments and how people might be very different working in a very close environment. And also, do you have any advice about how to help someone recognise that they need to adapt their behaviour if they don't seem to be aware of their impact on others, and any attempt to address the issue results in distress?
I think that's where, going back to perhaps the GROW coaching model, or the asking open questions, and just opening something with, you know, some very, very general questions, you know, so how are things going, you know, how's your relationship with customers, with colleagues, and then you almost drill down. So there is an element of patience involved, because sometimes it can take you quite a while to get to the nub of it. But if you ask enough questions in an open and steady toned way, you should be able to get down to a few reasons and things to uncover really what's been going on.
That's great advice. So some gentle persistence might help to sort of break down some of those not necessarily barriers, but the way that people listen to what you've got to say. Brilliant. I have one more question for you, and somebody has asked about how would it work if religion or different nationalities and races working together, because obviously there's a lot of differences in people as well as in their religion, their races. For example, the example that this person has given is accepting a woman as a supervisor or team leader when it's not necessarily part of their own culture. How can we approach that?
I think that's a really interesting one. I suppose one of the things that I would do would be to if you're working as part of a multicultural team, is independently perhaps try and understand about some of the culture, some of those feelings that are obviously going to be overlaid with, you know, some of the things, you know, personality styles and other things like that. So it's probably building a greater understanding of differences and the impact that they might then have.
Thank you. That's very good advice. Getting to know one another better, I think, is excellent advice. Yes, most definitely. Well, that's all the time we have for questions for Maggie Newton. Thank you very much for your presentation. What I'm going to do next is hand over to Maggie Clinton. Maggie Clinton's presentation today is sort of on the back of last week's Mental Health Awareness Week. We think it should be more than a week of mental health awareness. We think everybody should be aware of their own and others' mental health more than just 1 week in a year. So I'm going to hand you over to Maggie Clinton. She's the founder and director of Wrenwell Limited. Welcome, Maggie.
Good morning, Ria. Yes, absolutely, totally agree. And thank you for highlighting that it was Mental Health Week last week, but it's important that we have an awareness all year round. So, yes, good morning. My name is Maggie Clinton. I'm the founder of Wrenwell Health and Wellbeing, and obviously delighted to join you this morning. And I'm going to be talking about how our mental health impacts upon our ability to manage conflict. The background that I have is as an occupational therapist, so working within an acute mental health setting, but really most passionately about working as an advisor, a trainer, consulting within the workplace organisations. And that's enabling teams or individuals to identify how mental health affects our ability, not just to perform and function on a daily basis, but also to recognise how conflict as part of our daily life can be affected by how we actually feel, how our mental health is. So I'm going to start with some statements, aren't we, Rhea, just to ask people a question. Did you want to talk through, Rhea, or did you want me to have a talk through?
I'm more than happy. We've got another poll for you. This is a little bit different because this is a bit of a quiz that Maggie is actually going to answer the questions to once we've done the poll. So I can see that you are voting. So, do you think that the following statements are fact or fiction? Select the ones that you think are fact, and you can select as many as you like. So do you think these are fact? Mental health problems affect how we think, feel and behave. We are more likely to avoid conflict with work colleagues. Mental health is less important than physical health, and our mental health tends to stay the same. So do you think those statements are fact? If you do, put a tick next to the ones that you think are fact and click the submit button. I can see lots and lots of people have voted already. So what we're looking for is the ones that you think are fact. Do you think the following statements are fact or fiction? Select the ones you think are fact. Mental health problems affect how we think, feel and behave. We're more likely to avoid conflict with work colleagues. Mental health is less important than physical health, and our mental health tends to stay the same. Okay, we've got majority of you voted, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results with you. And Maggie, I don't know if you want to talk through them before you show what you consider the answers to be.
It's actually really good to have a look at the responses there. I mean, these statements, they always raise a bit of debate, and that's the whole idea, because we're just sort of thinking about our awareness. There's no wrong or right answers with them. So I will have a little talk through. What are the percentages on these, Rhea? What were the statistics? So with mental health is less important than physical health. What were the responses there?
Mental health problems affect how we think, feel and behave. That's 96% of our audience think that's fact. We're more likely to avoid conflict with work colleagues. Now 63% of people think that's fact. mental health is less important than physical health. Nobody thinks that's a fact. Everybody thinks that's fiction. And
Yeah.
our mental health tends to stay the same. 4% of people think that's fact.
Right, that's wonderful. So that's a really good response. So if we come on to the next slide, let's have a look at this. So mental health problems affect the way we think, feel, and behave at work. Well, this is a fact. But the big point here is we don't switch on and off, do we, when we go into work? Mental health affects the way that we are in all areas of our life. So when we're feeling a little bit low, and we're not feeling ourselves as healthily as we usually do, we don't think so clearly, and we tend to think more negatively. So this can have an impact on the way that we do deal with conflict, particularly within the workplace. We can often feel very sensitive, so we have an emotional response, emotional feelings. So when people are sort of disagreeing with us or challenging us, we can perhaps feel a little bit more sensitive than we would do normally. And again, looking at Maggie's focus on personality types, though we might feel slightly more domineering or slightly more need to get more popular or more caring. So it may in fact increase those personality types or reduce them. But we can also feel physically fatigued as well. We can have a sense of exhaustion and feeling very tired. And our behaviours as well can become very unhelpful. But we'll come on to that a little bit later. So more likely to avoid conflict with work colleagues. And this is quite interesting because it was quite a split answer. And we've put here, it could be both fact or fiction. So we do tend to avoid conflict when we're feeling that we're lacking in energy, we're feeling a little bit flat, we're feeling quite anxious. So we often avoid social situations. So anything that engages another colleague, when we're experiencing mental health issues, we may not be quite so confident to come forward and say in a way that would be agreeable or that we feel confident to do so as we would do normally. We're not just avoiding colleagues, we can often avoid the work itself, and we're very good at hiding things. So that can actually cause conflict as well. Rather than addressing that and saying, I'm really not managing with my workload, or I'm really not getting on with my colleague, we tend to avoid coming forward and saying that. So the issue doesn't get resolved. It ties in really nicely with Maggie's model there. ACAS have got some statistics that they've brought out that actually 37% of sufferers of mental ill health are more likely to get into conflict. So opposite to avoidant, we might get more aggressive, more snappy. We might be more determined about protecting our space or our views. So we might be more volatile. So that's quite an interesting thing that it was a split answer there. So mental health is less important than physical health? Of course not. The two are completely combined. If we have got physical ill health, pain, discomfort, we have an enormous amount of worry, anxiety, impacts on our mood completely. So to separate the two is really not realistic. The thing a lot of people don't understand is when we're experiencing mental ill health, we're not going to break down into the conditions here because we haven't got enough time, but generally it has an enormous impact on our physical health. So all of our physical systems from top to toe are affected. And again, it can leave us feeling very tired, very uncomfortable. So both are equally as important. And our last statement, our mental health tends to stay the same. I've put down here that it is fiction. And the thing here is to have a look at, are we able to recognise when we have good mental health and when we have poor mental health? So that's really what we have a look at in our next slide. So when we feel well, we tend to be able to manage the stresses of daily life. So those pressures at work, if somebody's disagreeing with us, if the job load's getting higher and higher, we are able to manage that. We're able to show a range of emotions. We might be quite cross about something, but if we say, hang on a minute, I don't agree with that, we can manage it. We're still able to maintain healthy relationships. We have disagreements, we have conflict, but after that we're able to reflect and say, look, you know, we didn't agree on that, but maybe we can go forward, as Maggie was saying, with the collaboration, maybe a little bit of a compromise. But when we are not feeling so good, there are certain signs, and I'd like you to have a think on, do you recognise any of these in yourselves? And you will do, hopefully, because these are normal responses to poor mental health. Bear with me. Just bring those back up again. Thank you. Oh, hello. Rhea, are we going backwards or forwards? Can you help me with that? Thank you. So changes to thoughts and feelings, as we were saying before, we can not only have those changes of feeling more sensitive, we may worry a great deal more about things, we have a loss of confidence and that withdrawal, we're less likely to engage. We may even have difficulty maintaining our self-care. So if we're really worried and anxious, it's going to have an impact on our sleep. It's going to have an ability to plan outfits and our routines for the next day. It may change the things or the way that we eat or relax. So we're going to start to look a different way. We might feel a little less tidy. We might be very intense on the way that we're managing our self-care and hygiene. Anxiety arousals are going to heighten. So that means if we feel anxious, that's a natural response. But we're going to start to feel it physically. We're going to have rapid thoughts. We're not going to be able to switch off from situations. So if something's worried us, we're in conflict, it's going to really worry us, not just in the workplace, but beyond that. And similarly with things at home, we're going to bring those into the workplace, and that can cause conflict as well. So we're going to lose a lot of motivation generally about solving situations and solving conflict. So just moving on, a question for the audience.
Yes, we want you to just pause for thought and think about what Maggie's just said there. Do you recognise any or all of these signs in a colleague or a team member? It's all very well as talking about them, but has it sort of rung any bells with you and thought, well, actually, yes, I've seen a change in one of my colleagues. And this is just for you to actually perhaps reflect on what you've just heard and think, well, actually, there might be somebody in my team or one of my colleagues that's perhaps not coping very well. So we've got about 3/4 of you have voted. I'll give you another moment. So did you recognise any of the signs that Maggie was talking about in a colleague or a team member? Okay, I'm going to close the poll and show you the answers. So there you go. 73% of you, which is almost 3/4 of you, actually recognise those signs in a colleague or team member, which hopefully today's presentations will give you some ideas about how you can perhaps start a dialogue or approach the situation. So thank you very much for everybody for sharing that. I know that's sometimes quite a difficult thing to do. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to hand you back to Maggie.
Yeah, that's great. It's really a great relief to see that people are sort of considering this as something that may have an impact on conflict. Why are people being very sensitive? Why are they being very abrupt? We'll have a little look at unhelpful behaviours now. And again, looking at these in ourselves is the most important, but also we may pick up a change in personality type, as Maggie was focusing on. They might have differences in how they're responding. When we're not feeling very well, our emotional responses change, so they might become quite extreme, and that's often as a way of developing. So we might snap at people, be avoidant because we don't want to engage. Any more conflict is just going to be too much for us to cope with. So if that's happening, then the responses can be very unhelpful and cause problems for not just ourselves if we're experiencing poor mental health issues, but also for those people around us. So let's have a look at some of these, and I'd like to have, again, as we're really saying all the way through this, have a think about how you may respond, or again, colleagues, if they're experiencing mental or physical health. So if we're in pain physically or emotional, are we starting to look a little bit like this? So we might be very difficult to talk to, or somebody around us might be very difficult to talk to, and that might be as a result of being emotionally very cold, quite abrupt, aggressive. This is going to have an impact on those work relationships. We might take that personally, and we might be less inclined to collaborate with somebody or compromise with somebody if they're being very unforgiving or they're being judgmental, their tolerance has reduced. And this may be as a result of internally, mentally, we feel very tense, we're worrying a lot. If we try and sort of go forward and say, well, let's have a chat about this, you know, it might be helpful if we can help you with your job load, this might be seen as criticism and could be received badly. So we tend to focus on meeting our own needs. Often that's the only amount of mental and physical energy we've got. So we might appear to be very selfish, quite inflexible and unhelpful. I can't help you, haven't got time for that. There tends to be an abruptness. We're not as flexible as we would be when we're feeling well and healthy and able to communicate well about the conflicts that we're experiencing. So this is when things ramp up a bit. So all of those of us who think, I just want to avoid it, I really don't feel confident about this, these may be the concerns that we're going to end up in an aggressive conflict. It is very rare, but it does happen, as Maggie Newton was saying before. So perhaps you're thinking, well, this is a face I see every day. It might be a management style that some of you are experiencing. But one of the things we need to watch out for are a set of physical changes that we go through when we are starting to feel cornered, when we are starting to feel as if we have not got a way out of things, and we start to respond in a very aggressive way. So the eye contact might be more direct. Our facial colour will change. We might become redder in the face. The facial expressions are very tense, taut. We'll see here this photograph is a great example. The frowning, the direct eye contact, baring of teeth and screwing. There's almost like an animalistic roar that's coming your way. The head position is up. You know, there's a warning sign there saying, right, I'm going to engage in conflict. And physical posture tends to grow. We're not necessarily shrinking back at this point. We're stepping forward. There might be big gestures with the arms, so movements within the limb and the body. So if behaviour starts abruptly or stops abruptly, we may need to take action very, very quickly. So what can we do? Some of the quick solutions that we would ask you to look at, keep it very, very simple. Have a change of scene. Try and remove the individual or encourage the individual away from the situation, to step outside, to step into a room. Change the scene. Try and have a quiet word. Now, within a quiet word, we need to listen. And when whatever comes out, this is a difficult thing, we need to be completely accepting of that, considering this may be a mental health issue. So somebody might use inappropriate language, they may be rude, they might be shouting, but we need to just accept that, just to let that expelling of that anger, that frustration. Trying to offer people choice and control. So what would you like to do now? How can we help? How can we support? Those are the sorts of dialogues that are coming out. And trying to respond to those needs. I want to be left alone. I want to go home. I want to go and sit in the office. I want to go and have a chat. How can we support those needs? Okay? How can we collaborate with the individual to try and actively get a positive response and actually seeking support for the individual? So this may be support within the workplace, just that understanding, what support have you got in place. It may be that the individual actually needs further and more serious help. This is something that we could go through in more detail if we had a little bit more time, but there are things that you can have in place within the workplace where you actually go through an official needs assessment. So instead of a performance review for aggressive behaviour, we're looking at a need to support somebody's health and well-being. We'll send you the slides on that, but we need to record what's gone on. The assessment doesn't need to be formal, it can be informal. We might need to implement some stress management, or we might need to refer them to the GP, or ask them who have they got, what support have they got at home or as a colleague that can refer them forward. So just to finish off, really, try and ensure that you and all your teams are trained on managing conflict within mental health. So that could be mental health awareness for all employees. And look at coping strategies. So have a think, what have you got in place? We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. It's just starting conversation, recording incidents, regular reviews, as we say, an open door policy. The most important thing is to retain confidentiality at all times. So Caroline will come more into resolving those issues when things start to become a little bit more formal. So if anybody's got any questions with regard to mental health issues and conflicts, we have a moment now.
We do. Thank you very much indeed, Maggie, for your presentation. Again, incredibly interesting subject. Particularly for me, when I looked at the unhelpful behaviour, sort of recognising behaviours in colleagues and not just thinking, oh, they're just being awkward or, oh, they're in a bad mood today, that actually there might be something else going on. And I think sometimes we can all be very guilty of making snap decisions rather than actually thinking, well, let's have a see if there's something other than this. We do have some questions for you. The first one I wanted to ask you, we've had a question, and this is from the other side of the coin, if you will. If you recognise signs of poor mental health in yourself as a manager, how should you deal with this with your team, especially if you've got a stressful day ahead? Do you have any tips on that?
I would always recommend that people try to be as honest as possible. Anybody within the workplace does not have to give personal detail of their circumstance or their experience, but we can have a very quick morning meeting, quite informal. Let's grab a cup of coffee or let's have a little walk. Today is going to be tricky. There's a lot going on. To be honest, team, my energy levels are a bit low today, so I'm going to really be asking you to give me some support. And the wonderful thing about working as colleagues is to be asked for help. We don't always like to be dictated to. It's a really wonderful thing if people are given the opportunity to say, yeah, I'll take that off you, or can you remind me of this at lunchtime? So perhaps get them to make a bullet point with you and go through with the team or the other individuals, like, how can we get through this? And understand that you're not going to get through everything. What's the prioritise? How can we prioritise this? So ask for support from whoever. We're all human beings. Forget the hierarchy. Just say, right, this is what we need to get through. I need some help.
I think that's great advice. I think the majority of people want to help. You know, there's not many people out there that want to see you fall over or fail or get upset. So I think that's excellent advice. Thank you. I have another question. If I find myself getting upset when I'm stressed at work, have you got any tips at what I could do in the immediate? I presume that means sort of straight after, as you feel yourself getting upset.
Absolutely. A very quick 3-minute plan. So firstly, whether you're sitting, stand up, remove yourself from the situation. Even if you're in a meeting, just excuse yourself. Just say to whoever you're with, excuse me for a couple of minutes. You don't have to explain, just try and get yourself away from the situation. It could be a desk full of papers, it could be a busy meeting, it could be a dialogue with one other person. Take a deep breath, just blow out and remove yourself, and then do something physical if you've been sitting for a long time. So just take a walk, either outside would be ideal, but up and down the stairs, around the office, and focus on your breathing as you walk. You want to try and regulate any breath holding, any sort of shallow breathing. Try and breathe more deeply. Hydrate, so go and get yourself a glass of water or make yourself a drink. Try and reduce refined sugar. If you're feeling anxious, feeling stressed, avoid the sugar, avoid the sweets. Have water, have fresh air, and try and do some physical stretches. If you have some time, go and have a chat to somebody, let off steam. But the main thing is remove yourself. Sit if you've been standing for a long time, stand if you've been seated for a long time, rehydrate and regulate your breathing.
Great advice. That's something that we can do immediately. It's not necessarily something that's a long term, but it's really good advice about removing ourselves away from that. Fantastic, thank you. I've got a couple more questions. I'm just looking at the time. The time is actually moving on a little bit. So to the people that have asked questions of Maggie Clinton that we haven't had time to get to, I will pass them directly on to her and ask her to respond to you in an email, if that's okay. Thank you very much, Maggie. I'm going to now go on to the last session for today, which is conflict management, and that's with Caroline Robertson. Caroline is the CEO of Actif HR.
It's probably good afternoon by now, actually, isn't it? So I'm delighted to join you as a presenter today. I'm Caroline Robertson, the CEO of Actif HR Limited. We're a human resource and employment law consultancy to business based at Silverstone Park. I qualified as a solicitor nearly 20 years ago and have run a consultancy business for over 15 years, guiding managers with all elements of human resources. Conflict management, it's an inevitable part of work. We've all seen situations where people with different goals and needs have clashed, and we've all witnessed the often intense personal animosity that can result. These conversations, they shouldn't be avoided, and it was great to see the first poll question where 7% avoided, so that was very low, which was great to see. The ability to be able to talk about sensitive and emotive issues is an integral part of effective line management and can be critical to managing performance and improving team dynamics. The good news is we've got some very practical steps you can take to handle these conversations better, to get a better outcome for your employees, yourself and the organisation. And I'll be taking you through my top 5 tips, being facing the problem, the preparation you need to do, containing the problem, questioning tips, and a quick step summary. Next slide. Facing the problem, the first thing you need to ask yourself is this my problem? Most problems, be they performance, conduct, or absence, are dealt with by the line manager. Although this is not always the case, you need to think about the kind of issue and if there are any situations where a more senior manager or HR specialist should be brought in to talk to that employee. Some issues may need to be dealt with as part of a more formal process, such as dealing with grievances. The now or never moment, you should instinctively know the right moment, we hope, to deal with that problem. It was good to see that in terms of managing and dealing with the conflict, the 54% of you were able to actually have that conversation, so that was a good start. You should issues often crop up without warning. The trouble is, if you put it off, as many managers do, the issue often becomes bigger or runs the risk of lulling employees into that mistaken belief it's not such an issue, or denying that employee the opportunity to be able to improve, which may be more damaging for the business in the long run. So make sure, of course, that you have that quiet word at an early stage. Keep in touch with your staff and the team. If they see you are approachable and ready to listen, they are more likely to come to you at an early stage. Keep a check on the managers so they know to feed the problems through to you and other team members. So we all know that scenario where the manager brings an employee in to talk about timekeeping, it snowballs, it becomes heated. The employee says the manager is picking on them. He said it's not been mentioned before because we've not dealt with it at an earlier stage. And it's important, and that was great that Maggie Newton mentioned that awareness of mental health issues and how you respond to that, bearing that in mind in those early conversations. So the points to take away: did you speak to the employee as soon as you noticed there was a problem with timekeeping? Did you plan what you were going to say and how they might react? Did you think about the outcome you wanted? And did you focus on the issue and not the person? You can see we've got a question for the audience.
I got another question for the audience. We'd like to ask you, please, how much do you prepare before a difficult meeting to discuss a problem? And this can be as a manager or as a colleague. Do you prepare? Do you keep evidence in a file, including notes, dates and times? Do you make some notes to help you plan a conversation? Do you think about how you'll start the conversation beforehand, but don't really make any notes? Do you tend to wing it and gauge how it's going to go on the day because you want to see what happens? Or do you just try not to think about it because it's not a nice thing to do, have a difficult conversation with somebody? So I can see that the majority of our audience have voted. I'm just going to give you one more second. There we go. And I'm going to close and share your results. So 23% of you prepare for a difficult meeting by keeping all of the evidence, notes, dates and times. 55% of you make some notes to help you plan the conversation. 9% of you think about how you'll start the conversation beforehand. 14% of you, very honest 14% of you, say that they tend to wing it and gauge how it's going on today. But I'm very pleased to see that nobody decides they're not going to think about it at all beforehand. So I'm going to hand you back to Caroline and see what she thinks about those results.
Well, that's actually great to see that 55% do some preparation. And the key for me is the preparation and that planning, and also the notes that you may take of those conversations, particularly with someone like me that comes into a business afterwards to assist. It's just looking at the notes that we have down. So I am quite surprised at how little planning managers sometimes put in. It's vital to establish those facts and the specific evidence beforehand. You may need to decide on an appropriate location of where you'll have that discussion. Maggie Newton touched on that. You need to be able to have an open, frank, one-to-one conversation in private. Think about the room layout. It's less threatening to sit side by side someone rather than opposite them. And allow sufficient time. Don't forget to allow for breaks. Obtain evidence if it's been raised before and by whom. Have a note of this to hand. Refer to targets and objectives. Maggie Newton also referred to goals and how important that is with targets and objectives. That's where a job description and objectives are useful. Check if there are any other circumstances, even outside of the office, that may have an effect on the employee, and be aware if they've become withdrawn. Check your policies. It could be a performance issue, and I think of that as can't, something they're finding it hard to do something and they can't do it. Or is it a disciplinary issue? And I think of that as won't. Be aware you need to deal with these differently. Perhaps you may use performance management as a tool. Or we need to think, is this a disciplinary issue? Do we need to start that early conversation? Is this part of an investigation stage? Is this an informal stage? Or do we need to think of it as a more formal action? Think about planning the possible questions to ask. I cover questioning techniques a little later. And what possible outcomes there could be. Do you need management or HR support? And here's another question for the audience.
Yes, we have another question for you. And this is a very simple yes or no. Do you agree an expected outcome or next stage after any meeting? And again, this could be as a manager or as a colleague. Do you have an idea of what you're going to do after the meeting? Simple yes or no. You can see people are voting very rapidly here. I'm going to give you 5 more seconds. It's a bit like countdown. I feel like I need the countdown music to go on here. Okay, I am going to share those results with you. And we have a rounding 95% of people who voted says yes, they do agree expected outcomes or next stage after the meeting. This is very reassuring, and I'm sure, Caroline, you'll find that reassuring as well.
Absolutely, extremely reassuring to see that. Often I find that there isn't a structure in place after a meeting. People tend to go around in circles, but looking to the future, that is about don't go over old ground in a meeting unless it's a grievance issue, of course, then you need to deal with that appropriately. Try and remain firm. If they keep bringing up previous issues, look to the future, agree an outcome to move forwards. You need to concentrate on future conduct and behaviour. You need to refer to policies and procedures to reinforce the company position. Make sure you focus on the issue, not the person. This goes back to how important it is to plan what you're going to say in advance to allow you to remain in control of that meeting. Be prepared to set boundaries. You do not have to agree to what the employee is saying. It's fine to restate your position and the company position to offer that clear guidance. I often find managers are a little woolly about that, actually, and uncomfortable stating this is the company position. Handling difficult conversations can often be seen as a soft skill. It often becomes devalued because of this. It's fine to restate your position. Try and reach agreement if you can with an employee, but you do need to set out clear guidance and an outcome. Do not suggest an outcome that you do not follow up on. Keeping control. It's a real skill, knowing when to expand that conversation by seeking clarity and gaining understanding, and when to restrict it in terms of deciding what happens next. This can often be learned through experience. Many line managers go into difficult conversations with very good intentions, but often make the mistake of prolonging or intensifying the problem. Key to keeping control is the situations by keeping in clear boundaries, keeping a check on your emotions, knowing when to expand that conversation. So we're looking at your skills, and the way we communicate is vital. Most managers will be familiar with the theory that underpins good communication, for example, the importance of active listening and questioning techniques, as Maggie Newton discussed. But many of these skills can really be learned through experience. To manage a difficult conversation, you need to think about the way you communicate, your ability to take control of a meeting, and the importance of listening. And what does active listening involve? When we listen to others, we interpret the message that we are giving to us and them through a combination of words, tone of voice, facial expression, and body language. On average, we spend our working day communicating by speaking of 30%. Listening is 45%, and the rest of the time is by reading and writing. Skilled communicators use non-verbal behaviour to back up and enhance what they are saying, and that active listening is a vital part of our communication skills. Questioning skills. At the start of the discussion, we usually ask open questions. And in terms of the types of questions that we ask, open questions, of course, those are the why, the when, the how. We use those to begin a conversation, to put somebody at ease. However, from that point, it is fine to have a script, perhaps of the questions that you might ask in that interview, that discussion. You may want to start off by putting somebody at ease so we can read their body language to know how they will react when they're giving us truthful, easy answers. But from there, we need to think about what kind of closed questions we want to use to elicit specific information. It allows you to keep control. They are not so useful to allow you to gauge someone's feelings, and these are the what questions. Of course, we'll move on to the probing type questions. The why did you say that? These are useful to seek depth and detail, but maybe make a sensitive employee feel threatened. Then, of course, we've got our leading questions, the questions like, what in particular made you feel like that? Again, it allows you to seek detail, but runs the risk of putting words into someone's mouth. Avoid the multiple questions. I often find when I sit in the managers who ask 2 or 3 questions in a row, and it's hard for that employee to cope with that. So when we're thinking about steps, it is about making sure we have a use of that framework for dealing with challenging conversations. Don't be afraid to have that pre-prepared script. It helps you to stay in control. In preparation, make sure that you have a note if anybody else has had that conversation with the employee before. Be clear about the evidence and the issues. Make sure you set that right tone by explaining the purpose of the meeting. Adopt a calm and professional manner throughout. Reassure them about confidentiality both prior to and after the meeting. State what the issues are and give evidence. Focus on the issue and not the person. Give specific examples, refer to dates, documents, work, or specific interactions. Explain the impact that problem is having on the individual, the team, and the business. If the meeting is to remind them about behaviour or their conduct, stick to that. Be clear about what you are doing. Ask for an explanation. Listen to what they have to say. They may just be needing to let off steam. Keep an open mind. Don't jump to conclusions. Acknowledge their position and mitigating circumstances. Try and explore those issues together. You can ask the employee for proposals to resolve the situation. And if new evidence emerges, maybe adjourn the meeting if this feels appropriate. Have a break. Remember that you are in control. Use your questioning techniques to avoid diversions or too much repetition. You may have to be firm and restate your position. Stay clear of emotive language and don't respond to manipulative behaviour. But at the end of the day, you need to make a decision. You are in charge. And as you are all doing, which, well, 50% of you doing, document any agreement and give a copy to the employee. This should set out the agreed outcome, dates and standards required, monitor the progress, any support or training to be provided by the manager, any consequences if that agreement is breached. So that's really from me. I'm very conscious we've got GDPR about to come in on the 25th of May, which I'm sure you're all aware of. It's the most widespread changes in data protection for 20 years, and that's very much about how we process that personal data we have on employees, contractors and customers, which we also can assist with the GDPR. So thank you very much. I'm conscious we've gone over time a little bit, but if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Again, a very interesting topic. It's really held everybody's attention today, I'm sure. The questioning skills were absolutely brilliant. It isn't easy, but it is a learnt skill, isn't it, with questioning? It's not easy to do. So
yeah, absolutely.
I'm very conscious we've gone a little bit over the time. I will ask one question of you, and then anybody else that's asked a question, we will get back to you individually. And I think it's because it's obviously within a meeting situation. If you're having a conversation with somebody, we've had a question: is it appropriate to bring up with a colleague that you suspect that he or she might have a mental health problem?
That is appropriate, and Maggie gave some great advice about walking with somebody. We often sit in that meeting environment, that room, and it's how you weave that conversation in. It might be walking to go and have a cup of tea. I don't have any issues. It's just the types of questions that you use in that open format. Hopefully that you can lead it from then to have that discussion with you.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Caroline. I am sorry that we're having to wrap up, but very quickly, we have a final question for you. Anybody that's out there, we'd like you to share with us. We asked you a question right at the beginning, and we said, how confident are you at managing conflict at work? Have you changed your mind at all? Has anybody moved from not very confident now to reasonably confident? Or would you still avoid it at all costs? We had 4% last time said they would avoid it at all costs, which wasn't a huge amount of people. However, let's see if people feel any different about it. Okay, I'm going to share that with you because I am conscious that we do need to wrap up. This is fantastic. The avoid it at all costs has gone down to 0%. The not very confident, which was 44% of you are not very confident in the last question, but now we've gone down to 5%. We have 90% of you are reasonably confident, and 5% of you have actually brought it up to extremely confident. So that's really, really exciting that people have actually come into this thinking, oh, I've learned something, I feel a lot more confident now. So thank you very, very much for your input today with all of those poll questions. As you can see on the screen, there are the details for our presenters today, both Maggie Newton, Maggie Clinton and Caroline Robertson. In your handouts, you'll find a handout. Our presenters today have very kindly offered all of the people that have attended today's webinar a 30-minute free consultation. It's absolutely no obligation. There is a handout there with these details on. Otherwise, you can always contact me, Ria Sheridan, at CIWM. Thank you very much indeed, ladies. Have really, really taken quite a lot from this webinar myself, and I hope everybody else has enjoyed it. We are going to close. I do apologise if it's gone into anybody's lunchtime. Thank you for taking part. Don't forget to complete the pop-up survey. There's only 2 questions. Thank you very much, ladies.